Riverside.
Welcome to Dance Talk with Joanne Carey, where the dance world connects, the conversations inspire, and where we are keeping them real. I'm your host, Joanne Carey, and today I'm joined with Jody Sperling of Time Lapse Dance. I have a feeling this is going to be a really interesting, motivating, creative conversation. Jody is the artistic director of Time Lapse Dance. She's got a vast background of work behind her. She has some upcoming performances. And really interesting, in my opinion, and I'm sure my listeners as well, take on expression and creativity and dance, which I'm so excited to dive in. So welcome to Dance Talk, Jody.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I just always like to start out with asking my guests to give a little introduction and a background about themselves for my listeners, to tell how you got started in dance. You know, was it as a child? Was it something as you got older in life? And what was that thing that really hooked you into dance and keeps you going?
It's funny because I don't have that that trajectory. I started studying dance when I was 5 at the Joffrey Ballet. I grew up in New York City,
Okay.
and like a lot of girls, I went to ballet class. But nobody in my family ever expected that I would stick with it or that that was going to be my thing. But that love of movement, the joy that you get from dancing and the creativity that you can express through dance, which I believe, just meshed with me in a way that surprised everyone, including myself. I come from a family of academics. I grew up in an apartment building with academics. It was the NYU faculty housing.
Okay.
And
Wow.
all my parents were, professors, and my friends' parents were professors. And I thought that you went to kindergarten and then, eventually you got your postdoc and then you got a job.
Not a bad track to be on.
So I want to say that I think that my entree into the dance field surprised, a lot of people. But there's something about dance that gets you hooked, and also that has a way of pulling together so many interests that you can have. Because I always loved dancing, but what I realized is that I love making dances, and I wanted to dance the dances that I made. And so then you are in an art form that is not just about moving your body, but it's also about musical expression. It's about visual design. It's about theater and, drama. And when you pull it all together, then you have, this incredibly complex and fascinating art of choreography, which is my
Yes.
lifetime passion.
Yes. And you're saying so many things. I tell you, there must be something in the water this week, because I was telling you off camera that, just for the listeners to know, I was telling you that I've been doing a lot of recording now that everybody's back, their seasons have begun and whatnot. But everybody is expressing that same joy. You mentioned joy earlier. And I know for myself too, the joy of dance and the joy that dance has brought to my life, when I got hooked on it and when I just was like, this is what I have to do for the rest of my life. And I am so delighted when I'm hearing from my guests that I've been recording with for this new season. Not that my other ones didn't. I'm just saying it's so in the forefront of my guests this season, the joy that they're experiencing and the joy that they have experienced and want to share with their guests. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront, because dance is something really joyful. Excuse me. And I feel it's joyful even when we're dealing with something on stage that perhaps isn't so joyful. Can you talk about that a little bit, or what your thoughts are on that?
You just made me think. I think a lot of people have like early, training that doesn't forefront joy. And I just like, we all, we have the sort of what we might call slightly oppressive, training
Mhm.
where we're, especially if you're a girl, maybe you're told you don't have the right body type, or maybe, you're sort of, they're trying to weed you out. A lot of pedagogy, I think in the old days, is about trying to like get the message through that you're not good enough.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the artist is this idea that, um, like only a few survive,
Mhm.
and it's this mentality of, competition, and the mentality of like, well, maybe you'll make it or you'll be discovered or something. But I think that there's been a shift, and I think you're picking up on it. And there's been a shift where it's really radical to forefront joy.
Yeah.
And that is,
Yeah.
and that's
It's
something we
great.
need to be doing in our practice. And I
Yes.
don't think I had a particularly lot of it in my,
Yeah.
in my early training. I will say that, you asked about my early training, and I did grow up studying at the Joffrey. And then at some point in high school, I discovered jazz dance. And in those days, in the 80s, I'm dating myself, you could just go and take class wherever. And I was listening to the podcast that you did with
Mhm.
Alicia McGrath, and she talks about how she would go take class when she was, at Columbia. And,
Mhm.
I did the same thing. When I was in high school, I would just bum, it was like $5, $6 off my parents, and go
Yeah.
take a class at Broadway Dance Center or at Pineapple Studios, all these places that don't exist anymore,
Yes. Yeah.
and you would take whoever was teaching, whether it was Frank Hatchett or,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
somebody like that. And I that was so fun and cool to be able to do as a teenager in New York, was just go and take class with all the people who were, auditioning for Broadway shows. And
Yes.
yeah, and so I got into, jazz, which is not what you would think from my bio today,
Yeah.
because I have a different kind of trajectory to the
Yeah.
work that I do. So when I got to college, I discovered modern and postmodern dance,
Mhm.
and also interdisciplinarity, because I went
Mhm.
to Wesleyan, and
Okay.
it was a way of thinking about dance from a perspective of cultural studies, or
Mhm.
from theory, like whether that was psychoanalytic theory or
Mhm.
Marxist theory. And I remember I was really privileged to be studying there, because when I was writing my thesis, which was on dance for camera, I was a fellow in the Center for Humanities. And so every week I got to participate in a symposium with other faculty, not
Oh,
students, but
yeah.
other faculty, with speakers on cultural studies. And so we'd have
Wow.
people come in, and that sort of informed how I was thinking about dance, not just as a physical practice, but as a social force, and
Wow. Okay.
also, and so that kind of framework really influenced me when I got into historical inspiration, which is,
Yes.
where the Loie Fuller thing started.
Yes. And, I just want to point out a couple things. First, I just want to backtrack just a small moment just for listeners too. So when you were studying with the Joffrey, that's when Joffrey was in New York. And now
Yes.
just for everybody to know, Joffrey used to be in New York City and now out in Chicago. But I
The
just want
school
to,
is still here, though.
yes, the
They still
school's
have a
still
school.
here. Yeah, but the company's
Yeah.
out in Chicago. But, you're talking about early on when you grew up in a household of academics, but your the way you approach and think clearly has that academic line as well. You've merged the two, which when I was reading about you and watching some of your things, I find so fascinating. That's why I knew it was going to be a really interesting conversation, because I think when an artist thinks that way, and it's not to say that someone doesn't have the instinct, but when you dive a little deeper, or the thought process goes a little further because of research or history or culture, I think it just permeates and makes things a little fuller. That's just my opinion. And I always loved, as a dancer and then as an artistic director of my own dance studio, I loved that aspect of it. I really loved when we were preparing for our end of the school season performance, of researching what I was doing and why, and getting all kinds of resources. So I love that you bring that to your work. Which, let's talk about your work. So where would you like to begin? First, I have to point out that you have this beautiful scarf on. So for anybody who's not watching the video, but is listening on one of the, the streaming services that doesn't provide video. Jody has this beautiful scarf on, and I find it reminiscent of your costuming and the
Well, it's so
flowing work.
interesting that you mentioned it because this scarf was actually made by a costume designer that I collaborated with from the scraps left over from one of our costumes, and she dyed them, and it was a gift to me. So I love wearing it because it
Mhm.
brings me
Joy.
closer to
Yeah.
the work and it reminds me of why we're here. I want to go back to your question about research because I
Oh,
think that
sure.
will help kind of situate where I am. I think that for many years, my inspiration or research came from history and thinking about this historical connection and how these um, things from the past sort of influence you and then sort of project you into the future. And if you can tune into and understand what those forces are, then you can really innovate and be original. So that was a real, like I would say, for a good long chunk of my career, I was really thinking about historical forces and a particular historical figure who I'll talk about in a moment. And then for the last 10 years or so, I've been really kind of drawing from scientific research and thinking about climate science and how that can inform the choreographic process.
Mhm.
So I'll kind of dive in and just tell you that the scarf that I'm relating to,
Mhm.
that I'm wearing, is made from scraps of a costume that was a tribute to Loie Fuller. And if your listeners don't know who Loie Fuller is, she was one of the mothers of modern dance. She was an extremely influential artist from about the 1890s to the 1920s. And she was American, but she got really big in Paris in the fin de siècle. And what she did was she danced in enormous costumes with
Mhm.
sometimes hundreds of yards of silk. And she was a technological innovator. So she engineered all these incredible lighting instruments and also media devices so that there would be images and kind of kaleidoscopic lighting effects thrown onto her costumes while she was dancing. So she created this absolutely spectacular, mesmerizing, hypnotic dance form. And what happened was she became a huge sensation. And so many of the artists at the day represented her in all different media, sculptures and prints and paintings and water, everything. And she became very influential in artistic movements from Art Nouveau and Cubism and even the birth of cinema. So some of the
Mm.
earliest color films were of Loie Fuller imitators, not her, but
Right.
Loie Fuller imitators dancing in silk, and then the frames of the film were hand colored to represent the colors that Loie Fuller produced on stage.
Do you know, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you know my grandfather was one of the first people to work with color photography?
That's incredible.
It
And
is.
people don't realize like how early color photography
Yeah.
has been around. Like the chemical processes like
Yes.
have been around like from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really alarming sometimes when you see like color photographs from the 20s or 30s because you're like,
Yeah.
wait, what?
Yes, yes, and the
So
negatives too. I
yeah.
forget. In one of my seasons, I was speaking with a couple different dance photographers, and I was talking about the negatives from his, the glass negatives that my mom has of his, which was always I always found so fascinating. But continue,
Well,
continue.
those glass negatives is interesting. There is something called a magic lantern,
Hmm.
and which is like the precursor to the slide projector,
Hmm.
or now like the LCD projector that we have. Nobody knows what a slide is anymore,
I know.
but or like a PowerPoint, but whatever. But they were, if you're in the video, they were like glass slides, either circular or square, and they would cast an image. And
Mm.
so Loie Fuller didn't just use lights; she also used this thing of casting images,
Like
and often
gobos
those,
almost, right? Kind of like
yes, but
gobos.
some
Yeah.
they were
Hmm.
like, well, she used gobos too.
Okay.
But those were like sometimes they were photographic images.
Oh,
So they could be the photographic images of the moon. And even this is uh, in one article, it says that she used X-rays of a cancer cell. She had cancer, and she
wow.
projected, like the pattern of the cancer, like onto
Wow.
the costume. So there's a lot of levels of scientific inquiry in Loie Fuller's work that she was even inducted as an honorary member of the Astronomical Society in Paris. And she
Wow.
was she became friends with the Curies because she was interested in radium and she wanted to use
Wow.
radium in her dances. And they
Wow.
were like, no, bad
Yeah,
idea.
you can't do that.
But she still did a dance with phosphorescent materials that she called the radium dance.
Wow. I did not know
So
all this, and my background's modern.
yeah, well, so
Wow.
this is the thing. People know Loie Fuller and they think, okay, mother of modern dance. Yes, and
And wow.
also like
Fascinating.
like a really influential person in film history,
Mhm.
really influential person in art history, really, influential person in this multimedia technology thing.
Wow.
So what's interesting is I got into Loie Fuller in a completely accidental way, which was, if I go into the story,
Yeah, no,
I
please.
was a kind of roll on the floor, experimental modern dancer, having gone through my, jazz and modern and postmodern
Mhm.
things. But I was also writing dance criticism, and I got a job working at the International Encyclopedia of Dance, writing captions for a 6-volume scholarly reference work on dance in all periods of history.
Wow.
And it was a wonderful thing that was supposed to be like a few weeks, and it turned into like a multi-year engagement. And so quite a history, this International Encyclopedia of Dance, really
Wow.
interesting. And the editor of that project was Elizabeth Aldrich, who was a
Mhm.
social dance
Mhm.
historian, wonderful film choreographer as
Mhm.
well. She choreographed some of the Merchant Ivory productions and just extraordinary human. And she put a picture of Loie Fuller on my desk one day and said, "Come see me in my office."
Hmm. Like,
So I was like, "Okay, what's this about?" So then she said, "Okay, let's do. I'm doing a gig at the Library of Congress, and I would like to do a whole evening that's like period. This was
oh.
1997, and I want to do something that celebrates the 100th anniversary of this building at the Library of Congress. So I'd like to do a Loie Fuller style number, a butterfly dance,
Mhm.
and why don't
Oh.
you be in it?" And I was
Wow.
like, first of all, I was like, what?
Yeah.
This sounds a little corny to me, like, and I had done a few Duncan workshops,
Mhm.
very,
Okay.
very eclectic background. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, maybe we could do something Greek. And no, no, no. She
Mhm.
was like, this is going to be fun. So it was fun. It was in the rotunda of the Library of Congress, which is
Wow.
this extraordinary, mosaic floor, vaulted ceilings, and there was an 18-piece live brass band in period,
Oh
costumes
my goodness.
playing Valkyrie. Dun, 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 dun,
Wow.
which Loie Fuller did use for her fire dance.
Wow.
And Elizabeth made me a costume that was pink silk wings and a little green skull cap and antenna, as I was the butterfly. And it was lightly comic. And I had 14-foot wingspan and I danced, and I had never in my life experienced so much breadth and expansion as I did
Wow.
when I was whirling around with these big sticks in my hands, these big wings. And I just was so captivated by that experience. I said, I have to figure out what this Loie thing is
Yeah.
about and keep doing it.
Okay.
And I will say for your listeners, this was one of the first evenings of work at the Library of Congress that was digitized
Wow.
for the collections. It was part of their dance manual collection. And so the performance is actually on the Library of Congress website today. So if you want
Oh,
to check it out, you can see it. It's a very young Jody dancing in big pink wings in the Library of Congress.
that's exciting. But I mean, and as you talk about it, I'm visualizing it because I've seen work with that kind of wingspan. Tell me where that starts though. Where is it Japanese influenced? All that. Where is that? Does that influence come from with the sticks? Because I
Well,
feel like
actually, historically, it's interesting you bring in the Japanese influence. It's not Japanese influence
uh-huh.
because there was this, although there is a Japanese influence on Art Nouveau aesthetic.
Hmm. Hmm.
And of course, there's silk in Japan, and like
Hmm.
she talks about the origin of her silk being from India. But
Oh.
there was this kind of music hall dance called the skirt dance, where
Hmm.
dancers used to like kind of wave their skirts
Hmm. Hmm.
around and make little patterns with their skirts. And what Loie Fuller did is take the skirt dance, which is kind of a popular 1880s vaudeville number, and she just added more volume to the skirts.
Okay.
And then as she kept going, she made the skirts a little bit more transparent, and she worked with more lighting, and she
Hmm.
added in these, and then she put sticks inside the skirt to make it longer. And so there was sort of, I have a slideshow where I kind of like can paint this visually, where you
Hmm.
see, the pictures of the skirt dance with their kind
Oh,
of
okay.
flouncy skirts. And then you see Loie Fuller in her first dance, she's wearing a flouncy skirt. And then you see her, and she's wearing a sheer skirt, and then she's
Hmm.
got more fabric, and then the fabric gets bigger,
Oh,
and then
cool.
what happened was all the people who had been doing skirt dances all of a sudden started doing what they called serpentine dances, which was following in Loie's
Hmm.
footsteps. And so it became a phenomenon. It wasn't just Loie doing her dances. Lots of women and
Hmm.
also men and
Hmm.
dogs and for
Hmm.
real
Yeah.
also imitated her
Wow. Wow.
act. So thus that we were talking about how there are these films that purport to be Loie Fuller, but they're actually not her. And
Hmm.
even today, museum curators will put up a video and they'll say it's Loie Fuller, and
It's
the
not.
scholar will have to go in and say, actually, it's not her, but
Oh, okay. Wow. And so,
listener beware.
yeah, and so that's how you, just from that one picture being put on your desk, that's how that was your foray into.
That was my entrance into Loie. And what happened was, I remember we were talking about dance training before.
Hmm.
Have you ever had a dance teacher say, imagine you had big raglan sleeves,
Hmm.
right? Or this was the 80s, remember? Or imagine that your arms extended into space. And
Yes.
so
Hmm.
it was like all of a sudden I didn't have to imagine. I felt it so palpably and I felt
Oh.
transformed. So what happened was I after that I said, let me investigate. And
Hmm.
so being in my scholarly way, I decided, let me reconstruct her first dance. And there's a story around that. So I did that and I wrote about it, um, gave a paper, and then I met this magic lanternist who used Victorian era magic lanterns, and I said, "Oh, this would be fun. Let's." He said, "Well, why don't we get together?" And we did a piece together where he threw antique magic lantern slides onto my costumes,
Oh, wow.
including a whole set of slides that were used to teach astronomy. So there were like all different astro formations
Wow.
and all what we might think of today as like double rotator gobos that give kind of like
Hmm. Hmm.
psychedelic
Yeah.
effects.
Yeah.
And so that was, we did that piece in 2000. Oh my God,
Wow.
I'm a long
Yeah.
time ago. And so then I started to think, started to get really interested in this period of music hall, like where women are sort of bending themselves into pretzels to sort of try
Uh-huh.
to impress the viewer. At the same time, you have this indulgent spectacle with the fabric. And I went on a kind of, I don't know, 10-year run or so, really investigating um, this period of circus, music hall, kind of femininity,
Hmm.
sensuality, and drawing on this historical period of the birth of Loie Fuller's
Hmm.
art. And as I kept developing it over time, I started to get more interested in exploring the Loie Fuller apparatus from a contemporary perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to use, and commission modern music. And
Mm.
then I had always been interested in the environment. I've even from when I was in college, I was
Mhm.
taking environmental science classes,
Wow.
and I was interested in and concerned about climate change. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's so alarming because when we think we've known about like all the stuff that's happening now, we knew that was going to happen, and it's always just like, why can't we as people get together and act? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So my work started to be about trying to get that kind of like sense of activation and
Uh-huh.
understanding around what's happening. So I did a piece in 2011 that was called Turbulence. And I had been exploring how this Loie Fuller apparatus, like when you have these sticks and you're having silk swirl all around you, that it's actually visualizing atmospheric forces that you
Mm.
normally can't see,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when you walk through space, like you're creating all kinds of like eddies and that in the air that are invisible, but somehow what's captivating about the fabric is that it actually makes it tangible, right? It makes the physics visible.
Mm-hmm.
And this physicist actually caught on to this work, and he started to use this piece Turbulence to show at conferences
Wow.
as example of ocean turbulence.
Wow.
And I started a conversation with this fellow. His name is Larry Pratt, and he's an oceanographer at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And I got in touch with him because I was interested in making a piece about the Arctic. Right here,
Mm-hmm.
my
Mm-hmm.
medium is white silk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, what better thing that can we represent than snow, ice
Mm-hmm.
in this landscape? And he introduced me to one of his colleagues, Dr. Robert Pickert, who invited me to accompany his scientific mission to the Arctic.
Yeah. Well, I read that and that's fascinating. Continue.
Yeah, so it was a 6-week mission with 50 scientists aboard an enormous icebreaker.
Mm.
We went north of Alaska into the Chukchi Sea, and we just cruised around sea ice the whole time.
Wow.
And every couple of days, we would have what was called an ice station, where the science researchers would get off the ship and they would make sure the ice was solid enough, and
Mm-hmm.
there would be somebody standing with a gun and make sure that the polar bears weren't coming
Oh,
too close.
wow. Right. I didn't think
Yeah.
of that. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Wow.
And then they would, once they were all set up, I would come down with my costume and like walk down the forecastle and get onto the sea ice and do my research.
Wow.
And what I did was I was able to dance on the ice in the course of that mission about a dozen times. And I brought the Loie Fuller
Mm-hmm.
apparatus. I call it this apparatus because
Uh-huh.
it's a tool that helps me understand the environment and also my relationship between, my physical self and these
Mm-hmm.
larger atmospheric forces. So I started dancing on the ice, and I was able to record those sort of sessions, and we edited them together into
Mm-hmm.
a short film.
Yeah, I saw that. I
Uh,
looked at that. Yeah.
yeah, and it kind of encapsulated kind of like time lapse
Mm-hmm.
of ice morphology, the
Mm-hmm.
melting and the refreezing. And that was really a point of transition in my career because I think before then, if you'd asked me, why do I call my company Time Lapse Dance?
Mm-hmm.
I would say, oh, because we have this historical inspiration and we're thinking about Loie Fuller and we're bringing it into the present. If you ask me now why I call my company Time Lapse Dance, I think it's because we represent in our choreography time lapses of natural phenomena.
Yeah.
And yeah. And so that started, it's been a decade, but it started a collaboration with the composer Matthew Bertner,
Mm-hmm.
he's an environmental and climate change composer, and he does this thing called ecoacoustics, which is where
Oh.
you listen to the environment and you record sounds of the earth, and then you use that information and that data in music composition. And so in our collaboration, we began with this piece that was inspired by my Arctic journey, and it was called Ice Cycle, and it represents in music and movement a kind of the journey of the ice, both the sort of annual cycle of melting and thawing, and also this very unfortunate trajectory of disappearance.
Wow.
And so we started to, develop this process of working together with that piece. Our next project was about wind and atmosphere and representing, it's called Windrose. And
Mm-hmm.
a windrose is a graphic representation of wind speed, variability, and direction. And it's kind of cool because when I say graphic, it's like literally a picture that you
Mm-hmm.
see that the scientists use as a way of representing the data. And then we use that kind of idea to make a dance that actually part of the impulse of the dance is not just to make shapes, but also to think about like the disturbance of the
Mm-hmm.
air in the place that we're making it. And so that as an audience member, you're participating in this kind of like atmospheric disturbance.
Wow. A couple of things I want to talk about. I want to go back
Yeah.
to the Arctic one, the Arctic
Yeah.
piece. When I watched, excuse me, I watched the clip you have, and when I watched that, a couple of things I noticed. First of all that fabric, and it's really beautiful through space. I love seeing that swirling and twirling and everything, the bending, everything that happens to it. But I also was struck by the black lines that are in it. You're in this sea of white, and then there's these black, lines on this fabric, which for me as a viewer, just the little bit I saw, I was like, gosh, is that like, the movements and the shifts of the plates and the ice and the cracks that's what I got from seeing that. And I just found that fascinating. And I also, a question I have for you is, when you're performing a piece like this, or any of your dancers, but you specifically, because you're here, how lost do you get in that? Because it's so much fabric, and you're entering this experience, I'm going to call it, you're giving this experience
Hmm.
not only to the audience, but what are you experiencing as a dancer when you're dancing these pieces?
Okay. Those are two great questions. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
start with the first one, which is the costume was actually painted, hand painted, based on a photograph of the ice at a different time of year from when I was dancing. So when I was there, it was completely covered with ice.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a sea ice. It was about 1.2 meters thick, so about my height,
Wow.
a little bigger, right? It's also at a place where historically would have been 5 meters thick, in this location. And now it's like a place where is it refreezing every year? And it may not be. And but it's also, when it goes through the process of freezing, there's certain stages of ice. And I had a photograph from the same ship that was taken the year before, and we used that to model the costume. And the reason that is how I feel like I was able to kind of embody this time lapse,
Mm-hmm.
because I was showing the costume was moving in a way that actually represented the way that the ice formed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you cut up. Those are
I
the
got
plates of,
that. Yeah,
yeah.
I got that.
Yeah, and it was the exact the exact location. And then in terms of the second question, which immediately just now went out of my
Mm-hmm.
oh,
How,
what does it feel like
yeah,
when
what are
you're
you?
lost?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if the reason that I keep doing it, as we talked at the beginning about the joy of moving
Mm-hmm.
and how as a dancer, like you get hooked on that
Yeah.
feeling and that experience. There's I have found this practice to be very joyful, and also allows you to transcend yourself.
Mm.
So, nowadays people write a lot about how, like, with psychedelics, you can like feel this like oneness with the universe, and everybody's like, take some mushrooms, But I feel like I have no desire and need to, because when I'm in this enormous costume, I feel that oneness with the universe
Yeah.
that people are seeking.
Yeah.
And because I feel lost in a good way, right? Like I
Yes.
feel released from ego
Yeah.
because I can, and I have a sense of what I might think of as the larger
Yes.
picture,
I was just going to
or
say, mm-hmm.
yeah, or gestalt is the fancy word that comes to my mind.
Yeah.
But it's like I have because I've been working in these costumes for so long, I have a kind of visual of the shape, the three-dimensional sculpture that I'm
Mm-hmm.
making when I'm whirling, even if I can't, if, can't see myself, which
Mm-hmm.
most of the time I don't, because I don't actually work in a studio with mirrors
Mm-hmm.
anymore. But I know the form,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's an experience of transcendence physically that is what keeps me in it. And um and it's an experience of being part of something larger,
Yeah.
and it's experience also of understanding that your impact is not does not end at your skin.
Mm.
I think we just like, especially in dance, we have this like very clear outline around our bodies, and we are very concerned with the shape or the silhouettes or the form and whatever, and that's so unimportant
Mm-hmm.
to being able to move people, right? Like it's about the impact that you have in the space and how people feel that. And so I love that this costuming or this apparatus allows me to dematerialize enough that people see like a truer,
Yeah.
you know, um, sense of what Jody is,
Mm-hmm.
than just like this,
Yeah.
the edges of
Yeah.
me.
It's, when you're speaking now too, it goes like cellular. Like it really seems to go and, like you say, transcend. And I see that with the clips that I watch, because I haven't seen any performances in person, for the listeners. I've watched the clips that are available on your website and YouTube and whatnot. But I do get that sense of being, for me, being lost in that, but not lost, you don't know where you're going, that it's not about you in that moment, it is about something bigger. And to be able, I think, as an artist, to be able to empty yourself. I've talked a little bit about this before on my podcast with different guests, to empty yourself and serve the piece, serve the music, serve the message, serve that, is so powerful. And I find in the clips that I've seen you doing that so successfully that it's so moving, because it is universal. You're touching on these subjects that are universal to existence. Not to sound, but that's what it is. That's what your work
But that's,
is.
I know sometimes as I said, I come from this very scientific background. My father is a, cognitive scientist, and, my mother's a psychologist, and
Hmm.
my grandparents were psychoanalysts, and, and we had some communists in there. But anyway, I come from this like very like, I don't know, clinical or like analytical way of thinking about things. But then sometimes when I talk, I surprise myself because I sound very spiritual.
Hmm.
And I think that, and that maybe like why I've sort of found this home at New York Society for Ethical Culture,
Hmm.
because I do feel like this way of dancing does connect with a larger way of thinking
Yeah.
about people
Yeah.
and their, and the universe
Yes.
and space and matter,
Yes.
and that's why it just continues to fascinate and delight me.
Yeah, and I congratulate you on that. I'm a firm believer that, artists, like I just was saying, we empty ourselves to serve the piece, to serve that divine inspiration, and that's a job of an artist. It speaks through us, and to get in touch with that on that level, I find fascinating. I find, some people love to walk in the grass, walk outside, to be in the silence of nature, the mountains, the beach, what have you. It's that same thing, but you're moving through it. You're actually moving and connecting through the movement that we don't see. We don't see a cell passing by, but you have captured it. You've captured it so well. I find it only a brilliant mind can do that. That's why I said when we got on that it was going to be I think a fascinating conversation, because it's it takes somebody's brilliant mind to really go through all those levels to communicate, I think, what so many artists try to do in any genre, in any whatever they're talking about, and you do it in a way that speaks to the audience, that lets them feel as well. And again, I say this with only watching video clips. I can only imagine seeing it in person.
Well, I hope you'll have an
Yeah,
opportunity.
I hope so too.
We
Yeah,
have
it's
a
just
very busy calendar coming up,
yes, yes,
so we
yeah.
just and you're always welcome,
Oh,
Jen. And
thank
I
you.
also to attend a rehearsal too, because it
Oh,
offers like a more intimate
hmm,
and
the process
personal
and
experience. Yeah.
yeah, thank you.
So.
Yeah, why don't we talk about some of the performances coming up and what that is for everybody and like
Well, I
yeah.
one of the really exciting collaborations that I have coming up is with the Paul Taylor
Mhm, yes.
Company. And that is so wonderful that it's finally happening. It's something we've been talking about for years, and with the pandemic, it got sort of
Mhm,
postponed. And Michael Novak, who's the artistic director of the company, has sort of been keeping it in mind to make it happen. And now we are doing that for the Lincoln Center season in November, and I just couldn't be more thrilled. It I'm setting two works
mhm,
on the company, and they're both very much in the vein of Loie Fuller tributes.
mhm,
And so they hew closely. Not it's not a reconstruction. I don't go back and do the kind of research that is like Loie raised her right arm and then she
mhm, yeah.
raised her left arm and
Mhm,
then she moved in a circle and then the blue light came on and then the red light. There's people who do that, and it's amazing, but it's not what I do. What I do is I'm trying to create an experience in this moment
mhm,
that sort of is timeless and universal.
mhm, mhm,
And we just talked about that. So one of the solos is called Claire de Lune, and
mhm.
it's to the WC, and it's everybody's
My
favorite piece of
favorite,
music.
yes.
Literally everyone's favorite piece of music. And it's just evocation of the night
Mhm,
sky. And it's a very very sublime kind of feeling, very ethereal, and there's kind of an angel moment in the
mhm,
middle of it, and the lighting is, these sort of lavenders and blues mixing with a kind of a golden moon color at one point. So that piece is just like a kind of, glimmer of light.
mhm.
And then the other piece on the program, which is especially thrilling for me because it's a
Mhm.
world premiere,
Premiere. Oh,
is called Vive la Loie. So it's
okay.
long live Loie. um, and it basically takes material that I made for the feature film The Dancer, or La
Mhm,
Danseuse,
mhm.
which premiered in 2016 at Cannes Film Festival,
Oh,
and it was
exciting.
directed by Stephanie DeGiusto. And it's a feature film about Loie Fuller. It's kind of takes off from her life. It's not historically, you know, uh, the director felt the
Mhm,
same way about history that I do. She wanted to make a piece with Loie as a character,
mhm.
but it's not, hewing to
You're
history so
recounting, yeah.
closely. Yeah. But I made a couple of pieces in this dance that were on a light box, the way that Loie did, where she had this
Oh,
underlighting and it was
mhm,
constantly changing color.
mhm.
And the star of the film, Soko, who's a wonderful actor and musician, wanted to perform the dances herself. And she
Mm.
had never taken a dance class in her life. So I had the incredible pleasure of spending about 5 weeks in Paris with her, training her every single day, all day in
Oh,
the studio, building her into the dancer who was able to perform them in the movie.
wow. Wow.
But the dances in the film are so short because it's
Mhm.
cinema, right?
Yes, yes.
So they're 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, right? So when I was talking with Michael, we were trying to figure out, well, we like those dances, but what can we do? And so
Mhm,
what we did is we took some of the music, um, from the film, which is Vivaldi revisited by Max Richter.
Mhm.
And we took some of the music and we created a kind of two-part montage. And then I'm taking and recreating and adding on like all of the best parts of that, and then just formulating a new dance that really is the best of what Loie can do. And
Wow.
it's going to be a sort of spectacular, because the whole thing is on a box and it's a 5-foot cube and there's lights inside.
Mm,
Um,
mhm.
and um, and the lights are kind of choreographed to the music, which is something that we're used to seeing now from
Mhm.
like music concerts. But
Sure, yeah.
that was one of the things that Loie did, was to create this like color
Mhm.
harmony. She even
Mhm.
had a whole theory about it. And so the effect is that the dancer is kind of hovering,
Is it one dancer? Is it a solo?
and it's so what I'm doing is there are two solos, and I'm teaching two different dancers each one of the solos, and then
Okay.
they're covering each other.
Okay.
Jessica Ferretti is going to be
Mhm.
doing the Vive la Loie, and Emmy, I have to, um, Wildermuth is going to
Mhm.
be doing the Claire Lune, and
Oh,
they're
okay.
fantastic.
I bet.
I think we talked earlier about this idea of creating something that's more than yourself.
Mhm.
And so this is like in the transmission of not just choreography, but like a whole technique and a
Mhm.
whole
Mhm.
style and a whole new way of moving and muscles that you never
Mhm.
used before. It's it's like I have to figure out what's essential, and it's like lifting this veil off me and like
Wow.
putting it
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
them, and then figuring out how to make them just like grow in it and own
Yes.
it, and be powerful and own their power, but also
Mhm.
be selfless,
Mhm.
like you
Mhm.
talked about.
Yes, yes.
It's like a weird thing, like being incredibly powerful but also just disappearing with
Yes.
as a human within it, right? And so um that's been like it's one of my favorite things, is to teach, to set this work on other dancers, and to
Yeah.
watch them just like,
It
you
sounds
know
exciting, and I have to say, you spoke about joy early on, and you still have that joy. Like it's so, but that's what's so wonderful to sit and talk with you about, because that joy, it's just in you and bubbles up from you and the work that you do. And you said it's funny. You said something not funny, but Claire de Lune, and that's everybody's favorite piece of music. But I pause on that for a moment, because there's a reason that it moves everybody so much, right? If everybody is so moved by something, more than they're not, there's a reason for that. So I'm trying to stay real attuned to things. Like when I hear something, or why
Mm.
is that moving me? Like what is
I
it? You know?
I don't know harmonics well enough to say it's because it goes
Right,
from this
right.
key to that key, or
Yeah.
it's just no, but I know there's a place where it kind of, for me, it slows down and breaks open.
Mhm. Mhm.
And at that moment, the dancer opens their wings and they take a step forward and they do the angel walk. That's what we call it.
Mhm.
And in that moment, I've had so many people come up to me when I perform this. They'll be like, "Oh my God, I cried at that
Mhm.
moment." And it's like, because in that moment, it's like all of a sudden things shift in a way that opens up your mind and your
Yeah.
heart. And
Yeah.
I think that like we need that. With like I'm glad that I'm projecting joy
Mhm.
and in this interview, and we all know that there's a lot of things that are really like, terrifying
Mhm.
and devastatingly
Mhm.
tragic, that are happening in the world all the time, like right
Yeah.
now, today. And there's a lot of reason to be scared. And
Mhm.
so if you can have that moment of, okay, things, that possibility for transformation, it just lightens your load minute to
Yeah.
minute. And yeah, so I
Yeah.
mean, my work, even though I think it is always has an element of joy in it, we definitely do not shy away from, um, heaviness,
Yeah.
too. And the topics, we did a whole, as it, climate change is the focus of our work for the past decade, and that's a pretty heavy
Hmm.
thing that people don't really want to talk about it. And I think uh, the way that, we can talk about it is to think about the joyful possibility of transforming our world into a better place where it's more sustainable, it's more
Hmm.
equitable, where we fixed a lot of the problems that have caused this crisis. And if we stay that way, then it's like all of a sudden we're motivated to want to get involved with these solutions.
Hmm.
And we're not just like burying our, head under our covers and saying, please wake me when it's over,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we
Exactly.
all have those days,
Of course.
but
Of
it's
course.
like, but to I feel like what we do in dance is so important and meaningful because we bring people together.
Yes.
We create communities around the work.
Hmm.
We allow people to think in ways that transforms, their lives, and maybe
Hmm.
opens up possibilities that they hadn't encountered,
Hmm.
and that is um, enabling them to
Hmm.
act. And
Yeah.
so we've very consciously, in our programming, I've talked about the Paul Taylor collaboration,
Hmm.
and that is, a new project, and it's just a small part of, my overall working. But with the company Time Lapse Dance and my 6 incredible, amazing dancers,
Hmm.
um, we have been, really grappling with the climate issue
Hmm.
and trying to think about how we can not just make dances, but how we can make and share dances in ways that advance, solutions. So thinking about creating those community
Hmm.
through performing, or how we can bridge communities together.
Hmm.
Just as an example, our latest piece is called Arbor,
Hmm.
and it's really about trees.
Trees.
And we use the Loie Fuller apparatus
Hmm.
for part of it, to kind of model the interconnectedness
Hmm.
um, that life, that tree
Hmm.
ecology displays for humans, right?
Hmm.
The coolest thing is that people discovered, oh wow, trees talk to each other underground, right? With this
Yes.
whole wood, in the last few years, tree science is like, oh
Yeah.
my God, the mycorrhizal fungi are helping the trees send messages and nutrients to each other,
Yeah.
and the mother trees are nurturing the younger trees, and not just trees of their own kind, of all different tree,
Hmm.
species. And people used to think, that trees were competing for resources, and now they're realizing, oh my God, they're not, they're sharing. And
Hmm.
also, it's not just the trees, it's the bacteria and the fungi, and it's a whole like complicated, messy
Yes.
symbiosis of life. And so I just thought, well, what a really good example for humans if we could be that cooperative and also
Yeah.
understand that it takes we did this program of Arbor and some other works, and we call it Community. It's
Hmm.
for children. And
Oh.
so we offered that at New York Society for Ethical Culture,
Hmm.
where myself and my company are the eco artists in
Oh,
residence.
very nice.
And so we have an ongoing collaboration with the society where we can rehearse and we can perform there. And but also we collaborate with the society to bring this work to communities that would benefit from it, or
Hmm.
and so this we did this free program for school kids. And also the society does a lot of support programs for local. There's a uh, public housing projects,
Hmm.
right? Like the society's on West 64th Street,
Hmm.
but there's a really big divide between, West 64th Street, like, and Central Park West,
Hmm.
and West 64th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, where
Hmm.
there's a large housing development. And Lincoln Center has historically created this, like, architectural divide, which, and they're just now reconciling with this and try to literally puncture holes in the wall to open things up. But what I've been doing with Ethical is we've been performing on the other side of that, you know, I don't, what's the word? It's not a monstrosity. It's a
Uh-huh.
wonderful thing. But on the other side of that megaplex
Okay.
of culture, right? And so we are
Outside?
bringing,
Are you outside?
yeah, we've
Hmm.
been bringing our dances to the New York Housing Authority campus itself.
Oh.
And so we have a performance on September 28th. I don't know when this program
Hmm. Hmm.
airs,
Hmm.
um, but in the Harborview Terrace garden, which
Hmm.
is in the West 50s. And
Okay.
so we not only perform on stages, but we also perform outside, where we essentially kind of create these,
Yeah.
tree communities
Yeah.
in places that really, like need trees.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's funny. A couple things while you're talking about the tree. I watched, there was a clip also on your website, I think. There was uh it was about trees. I think I don't remember what it was called, but there was something on there. And again, I comment on the costume because the way it was done and the lighting, and I felt like I was at the roots of the tree while I was watching. I felt like I went underneath the tree and that I was seeing what was happening beneath the surface, which I do think is fascinating. And when you were talking about all that, all the stuff that goes on in the ecosystem of the tree land, I'm going to call it, that's my scientific terminology. Um, I can't think of the book right now, and I don't think it's within my reach. But I got a couple summers ago. I had picked up a book. I was so drawn to it, and it spoke about those very things. It was about trees, and it was talking about. I was reading it so slow because I had to kind of reread it over and over again. Like the same page to grasp everything that was being said. It was what you were talking about with the layers and the moss, and you might think a trunk indicates that a tree is dead, or a stump I should say, but there's life going on under there, and how it feeds what's next to it. And I was amazed. So when you were talking about that, I was like, oh, I got to pull that book out again because it reminded me of that, and for listeners, it's not something that's like way out there. This is real scientific stuff that's
It
happening.
is. And I will tell you what inspired the dance. Actually, we were talking about the idea of research at the
Hmm.
very beginning of this. And actually, what inspired our piece Arbor is I went on in the pandemic, I went on a deep reading dive. There's a book, a very Richard Powers, who's a novelist, wrote a book called The Overstory, where trees play a kind of prominent
Hmm.
role. And it kind of gives a fictionalized account of activists who live in a tree to
uh,
protest logging, which is actually something that Julia Hill did, in the 90s when they were logging these old growth forests. And also, The Hidden Life of Trees might be the book that you're talking
Maybe
about.
that's what it is.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it could be. And Suzanne Simard, who's a very, prominent tree ecologist, wrote a book called Finding Mother Tree, which is like
Mm-hmm.
both a biography or memoir and also tells some of the science behind her very, fresh discoveries. And this way of the transformation and how people think. Because in forestry, it's always been you clear cut a forest, right? And then you plant trees in rows and you have to give them far apart so they're, have lots of space. And then she realized, you know what? That's actually, if you wanted to plant a forest, that's not going to give you, those trees are dying. They're not like growing up. And why aren't they growing up? Because they don't have the mycorrhizal fungi, because they're
Mm,
not close to other trees.
trees, yeah.
So it came out like her research, her scientific research, like really affirmed a lot of ethical thinking that you might have about how we need to be, more selfless and more community minded
Yeah. It's
in our thinking and for our survival. Like
Mhm.
that's what everything that to do with climate solutions requires us to be thinking not just about, me going to live in a bunker somewhere, but like me,
Yeah.
and it's not about sacrifice.
Hmm.
That's where people get wrong. It's like, oh, it's not about me giving up this thing. That's, it's about me having a larger sense of who I am,
Mm-hmm.
so that who I am encompasses my neighbors,
Yeah, who I
and
am in relation to. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and their well-being is important to my well-being.
Yeah, yeah,
My community, my cities, my nation, my all the people on this planet, their well-being is material to my well-being.
yes, yes.
And I will be better off when people on this planet, the majority of them are better off. And
Better off too.
I think that too long we've been in a mindset where we've been focused on exploitation, and once we get out of that mindset, we go to a much healthier place that's more sustainable. And there are all these messy connections,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah, yeah,
that we can kind of illuminate through art.
yeah,
And my art, it being this dance thing,
yeah.
and the costume, just to the the costume was created by the same artist
Mm-hmm.
who
Okay.
did the Arctic one,
Mm-hmm.
and the branches that she painted were based on elm trees.
Oh,
And
okay.
those elm trees are the elm trees in Central Park, which is near where I live, which
Wow.
are the last surviving stand of elm trees, because there's a blight, right? And most elms,
Mm.
died in the wild. But the thing that's so beautiful about the elm trees is they have these very elegant, branches, and that are like arms.
Mm-hmm.
And when what you realize is those fractal structures of tree branches are exactly like the fractal structures of our lungs, our bronchial
Yeah. All
tubes.
the wow.
Yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
people have said to me that it reminds them of, lungs and the breathing,
Mm.
and also root systems are
I was
fractal
just gonna say
systems. So,
systems. Yeah.
yeah, so I think when you get into thinking about like natural systems, you
Mm-hmm.
realize like the human body has the same patterning
Mm-hmm.
that forest ecology has. And
Yeah.
so the dance is able to kind of draw this parallel, this
Yeah.
kinship, right, between people and trees.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what yeah, that's why I feel, or what we're striving for in terms of meaning and impact, is to kind of help illuminate that
Yeah.
kinship.
Yeah, it's I find it fascinating. I really do. And I could go on and on. I knew this was going to
Yeah,
be no, really, I knew it was going to be a really fascinating conversation, and I enjoy it, because the depth of it is it has meat. It really does, and so many layers, and all the different you talk about the multimedia, the use of all that adds to. Sometimes, you can see a performance and the multimedia, you're like, why, but all the how you use it in collaboration. And again, I say this not having seen anything live, just from these little clips. You can tell it really, the thought process, and it's the choices are so specific to make it so seamless. And I commend you on that, because that's really that's a really thought out artistic process and a creative process that is, I think, at service to more than yourself. And I think that's what your mission is. Anyway, Jody, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for joining me. Is there anything
Oh,
that you want to leave the listeners with? Anything that I haven't said? I'll put all the information up. Like you said, you'll be premiering or not premiering. One's a world premiere, and the other one you're recreating for Paul Taylor Dance
hmm
Company. And I think those dates are in November, if I'm not mistaken, which I hate
yeah.
hate to say is right around the corner. Um, but like,
I was gonna
yeah.
say, you can that your listeners, if they want to learn more, they
Mhm.
can go to timelapsedance.com, and I have
Mhm.
all the Paul Taylor information up there, but also all our upcoming events will be
Mhm.
posted there. And I do share a lot of like behind the scenes clips on my Instagram. So
Oh,
that's
cool. Okay.
Jody underscore Sperling. So you can see more stuff there.
Yeah.
And I will also just say, Joanna, it's been such a pleasure. I think everybody everywhere just wants to be heard and listened to. And a podcast is such a wonderful experience, in being heard and listened to, and having a chance to share our innermost thoughts and
Hmm.
and process with your listeners. So thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for saying that. And you're welcome back anytime, Jody. I wish you all the best with your upcoming performances. Hopefully I can get to one of them or a rehearsal, which would be nice as well. But thank you everybody for listening. This is Dance Talk with Joanne Carey. Follow us, like us, and share, share, share. Thank you, everybody.
Powered by Riverside.